Hey everyone, and welcome back to City Skylines San Francisco. In this episode I'm going to work on the waterfront, and I'm going to start at the Bay Bridge and make my way north. So Rincon Park, the end of Market Street with all the plazas and all the public transport options that they've got there are the main focus of this episode. So the first thing I need to do is move all the roads and get those in the right place, or they're thereabouts to begin with. And you can see from this shot looking at the city that the waterfront is really the biggest thing that's lacking at the moment to bring all this together. So that's why I've sort of decided to move on to it. So not only are we doing those areas I mentioned earlier, but I'm also going to put the last of the buildings in here. And I'm going to mention it right from the start, but the scale and the roading here is not perfect. I realise that, and looking at Google Earth, because I've been looking at Google Earth the whole time I've been building, I can see how far out my city is here, unfortunately, in that regard. So I'm not too bothered by it. I've accepted it. I'm going to point it out now before I get a barrage of comments, or potentially. But realistically, to make this series enjoyable, I have to build this way. And as perfect as I want to make the city, it would literally take me 10 episodes just to finish a very small part of the city if I was doing it one-to-one, or, you know, as close to real life as possible. And yes, this is me justifying this to myself, but I really have to. I want to move through this series quick enough so that it's interesting enough for people to follow as well. So this part here you can see me working on is going to be the end of Market Street, and the road splits here in real life, and a tram runs right through the middle, and there's a couple of stops here and it looks all pretty. There's a couple of plazas and really nice looking surrounding gardens and things like that, and it took a fair amount of jiggling around with Move It and the node controller and road marking tool to get this right. And I wanted to, of course, make it functional as well, so I'm going to put some tram stops and stuff in here later on. And because of the nature of this build and the way that I've done it, you're going to see me constantly upgrade this intersection throughout the episode, so you won't really see it 100% finished until the end of the episode. So now that the road is pretty much exactly where I want it, I can move on to Rincon Park, and this is the name of the first little public space that we encounter along from the bridge, the Bay Bridge. And there's one thing in particular that makes this little park very unique. It's got this cool bow and arrow thing stuck into the ground that's called Cupid's span, and I think this is really neat and quite romantic, so I'm going to look to make this as well. And just quickly guys, if you notice the tone levels in my microphone have changed, there's a couple of reasons. I've upgraded my microphone and I've also changed where my setup is in my house, so yeah, that'll be why I might be sounding a little bit different. So with Rincon Park here, what I want to do is get the 2 cafe buildings in pretty promptly, and then get the rest of the gardens in place before I start building the rest of it. So at this point I've got pretty much a basic outline of where everything's going to sit. Then I can move in and start detailing a bit closer, and I start with around the cafes. Most of the detailing at this stage is just the round gardens, but eventually I'll put tables and umbrellas and stuff out the front of these cafes and make them very social areas. One thing I want to mention is my history on San Francisco probably isn't as good as what it should be, or I know it's not as good as what it should be, so I'd really like to know some of the history behind these places like Rincon Park. So if anybody does know the history behind it, please chuck it in the comments. And I guess the same could be said for a lot of San Francisco, you know, the history. If I knew the history probably as well as I should, then that may affect the way that I build. I'd hate to build an area that's really historic and just completely miss the mark with it. So yeah, that's where I need some input from you guys, and especially the folks that are watching that live in the Bay Area. I really appreciate you guys having an input on this series. And I think it's safe to say that as soon as I'm able to travel again, I will be coming to San Francisco. I have well and truly fallen in love with the place, and a lot of that has to do with the folks that have been getting in touch with me that live in the area. Just some really cool people, and they've let me know about some maybe little forgotten areas of San Francisco that I hope to include in the series as well. One thing I keep forgetting to mention is that the map is on the Steam Workshop. It's linked in the description, and I've been meaning to put this out there since episode 1. There's also a collection that needs to go with it, with about 42 or 43 items in it. So if you're interested in building along on this map, by all means get onto Steam there and grab it. It is worth noting that it's very much a builder's map. I've left a lot of trees out in areas and things like that, and the map has been created with intentions to build it out, obviously. The map is also not one-to-one, I think you guys have got that already, but it still offers definitely those San Francisco vibes and gives more than enough room to build on. And being realistic, if I was to import the actual San Francisco one-to-one, we'd only get one small part of the area, whereas the map that I've created allows us to build on both sides of the bay, even with just the vanilla 9 tiles. So getting back to what we're doing here on screen, I'm detailing up Rincon Park 100% here. This is how it's going to look when it's finished, minus one very important thing that we are going to build next out of some props and PO. I must have spent a good part of an hour going around Steam looking for something that resembled a bow and arrow that I could use for this. Anything, a shape, you know, a pole, string. I couldn't find anything, so I've actually had to make this completely out of props, and I'm using the Express Propway pack. I think it comes with the Chateau Highway. And just using PO and basically making my own from scratch. And without procedural objects, this is impossible. And in fact, I would go as far as saying this is actually really easy with procedural objects. You can color it as well. I color it all the appropriate color later on, and I use the round concrete prop for the string. And I've got to say, I am very, very pleased with the outcome here. I probably should have just done this earlier rather than wasting an hour looking for a bow and arrow. But this is indeed the final piece of the puzzle for Rincon Park, and placing this in gave me immense joy. It really all came together and looks lovely with all the buildings in the background as well. Before we move down towards the San Francisco Ferry building, I want to put a few more buildings in the downtown here and start to fill it out a little bit. And this is when I realised that my grid was quite a bit out. This road running along the coast in the real San Francisco is pretty much parallel with the grid pattern in the downtown. So you can see how far out the angle of the road is here. And I'm not going to lie, at first it did really bother me, but you know, I've just sort of learned to go with it. There's going to be compromises made because the scale's not 100%, and unfortunately this may be the biggest one that I make in the whole series. But as a result of this, Market Street doesn't line up perfectly with the ferry building, not on the angle that it is in real life. It still lines up, I make sure of that, but yeah, it's not exactly how we'd see it in real life. So to finish off these buildings along the coast here, there's one block here that looks like it has this really unique sort of round looking building on the end of it, and I'm not sure why, but I've decided to use this massive cruise ship and PO it so it's just the end of it, and use that with a few prop doors and stuff to try and make that building. And watching this back now, I wonder why I have done this, because I think there's much easier ways or much better assets I could have used and manipulated, but nevertheless, yeah, here we are with a massive cruise ship. So apart from the shape of the building, it also has like a lot of mess on the roof, lots of vents and air conditioning units and stuff like that. So I put some surface networks up on the roof so that I can put all of those things in place. And the rest of this block just looks like standard sort of American brick and tile type architecture, and they're all relatively small buildings. There's nothing really over 8 to 10 stories here, and this also happens to create a fantastic downtown skyline, especially when viewed from the water, with these buildings on the water's edge sort of rising up to the Salesforce Tower. Yeah, it looks really cool. So I shuffle these buildings around a little bit until I'm happy with the order that they're in and they match up to the back of our cruise ship nicely, and then I'll move back down to that cruise ship and start detailing a little bit more closely. So I want to put some glass around a bit of a deck and have some furniture out there, because in real life there's some decks here that look like it's either a hotel or maybe some really nice apartments, and you could imagine the view of these decks would just be magnificent. The view of the Bay Bridge especially would be pretty world class. I'd think it'd be front and center from here, as well as having a really good vantage point for all the goings on down on the waterfront. It would just be a really cool spot to hang out up here. And the rest of this area just gets detailed pretty lightly with just some decals and a little fountain out the front. I did really want to save the props for the waterfront that's coming up, because we go pretty hardcore here. So now I can start detailing the plaza that's directly outside of the San Francisco Ferry building, and this is really unique in a few different ways. Number one, it's got these really cool black and white style tiles that make it very unique to look at. Number two, it's also highly functional. There's bus stops, tram stops and all sorts going on here, with direct pedestrian access onto Market Street as well. So I have no doubt that in future this episode is going to be buzzing. I'm going to look to put all of those public transport stops in as well. I haven't got any of them in at the moment. Obviously, once I've got all the platforms and stuff built, we can go through and do that later on. Another iconic part of this plaza, at least from Google Earth, is these like star type monuments that they have in the middle of the black and white decaled area, and I've made my own out of like props and PO and asphalt here, because again I couldn't find anything on the workshop. I will admit I have no idea what these monuments stand for, what they are there for, how long they've been there for. They just look really eye-catching, so I've just tried to capture that part of it. And once I've got those in place and I'm pretty happy with them, I can start making like the tram stops, the platform tram stops. And again, I'm trying to make those look like the real life ones. I've used a surface network for the roof, and then I put some decals on that sort of match the real life one, and then the rest of the area is just these sort of bushy trees with little planters. And on Google Earth these trees are quite small, but I'd imagine once these grow up a little bit they'll offer really good shade for anyone waiting at these stops. And the next bit I move on to, I was really excited about. It's putting I think it's Armesto's San Francisco building down. And one unfortunate thing about this is I cannot PO the building. It's got sub-meshes that won't translate, so I've had to keep it this original size, which is unfortunately much too big for my version of the city. So yeah, unfortunately when you see those wide shots, this ferry building will look much bigger on this waterfront than it is in real life, but you know, again, meh, you know, it is what it is. The building is far too sexy for me to replace with anything else and far too iconic, so yep, it's just gonna stay like it is. So once that ferry building's in place, I can start doing the waterfront around in front of it, and I'm trying to keep this like the real life one, but I do have to compromise here. I'm not going to fit all of the stuff that's in real life into my version here. So I've had to pick and choose. I've put down the pier, I think is what it's called, which looks pretty iconic, and I've got all of this stuff here directly in front of the ferry building, which looks like it has markets, fish markets and stuff like that on it. There also looks to be some type of new plaza directly next to the San Francisco ferry building, so I've left a bit of room there to put that in as well. I've also decided to run a real road out onto this waterfront because I want real buildings out here. I'm going to make the market area an actual usable area where we get pedestrians moving through, so really looking forward to doing that bit. So as you can see now, I've got most of the main infrastructure in place, and once this is done we can zoom in a little bit closer and then detail her up. When we have a look at this dock on Google Earth, there seems to be three main areas out here. There's a cafe out on the very point, or some sort of restaurant by the looks. There's a ferry terminal to the what would be the right hand side looking at it now, and there also looks like the markets on here that I mentioned earlier. There's lots of vans and tents around. It looks like some sort of fish market. So I start here with the cafe right out on the very point, and I'm using this little Starbucks one. I put two down side by side to make it look a little bit bigger, and then I turn one of them into procedural objects to make it quite a lot larger and place it along the back. And we'll come back and detail this up a little bit more later on. The next thing I put in is the same wharf we used out at Alcatraz. I put that in the right hand side of the island, and admittedly this isn't actually functioning at the moment, but I'm hoping to get it functioning later on. Then I found this really cool market street on the Steam Workshop, and this is a real street with real working markets as low commercial, so I spread those out here in a formation that looks something like just a random market, and then put a few prop vehicles and stuff like that around as well. And I'm quite excited to see real people moving through this area and actually using it. So once I've finished laying down that market road and I'm happy with its layout, I can come back and start detailing a little bit more closely again. And I can safely say that up until this point I've been very conscientious with my prop usage, but that is about to be blown out of the water here. I've always had this little theory that a really highly detailed waterfront, especially around a downtown or CBD area, can really make the area look much more interesting, even just by detailing solely the waterfront, because it's so visual, it's so viewed. So it's safe to say that the waterfront here is going to get much more detailing than, say, the middle of downtown. I'm not going to do any detailing whatsoever in the middle of downtown unless it's a specific area that we're working on or an area of interest. So I guess with that said, the idea is going to be there'll be pockets of detail where we need it and no detail where we don't need it. And because this area here in particular is such an iconic part of San Francisco, I had to put some detail in here. I couldn't not do it. So I looked to expand the seating areas around the Starbucks coffee shop with more seating and umbrellas, and also some shade with some trees. And there's also a bit of an industrial area out the back for services and drop-offs and things like that. I also dodgy up the ground a bit with a few rough decals to make it look like it's had a hard time. And then the last bit to complete is the new plaza to the left hand side of the main ferry building. this nice little green space at the end of Market Street near the plaza. I'm pretty sure it's called CoosBar Park, something like that. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. But it's basically just a nice little green space with a figure 8 path with various paths coming off it connecting to the roadways, and just a few trees here and there. So I'm definitely going to put this in. I'm a big fan of the green spaces, especially near like CBD areas or downtown areas, so this was a must. The red tiles that you see here are supposed to represent an area called Embarcadero Plaza. I'm pretty sure this fountain here located at the edge of the plaza is called Valian Court Fountain. I hope that's right. Anyway, it's quite a unique fountain. It's got these really weird looking concrete pipes sort of sticking out. So I've done my own version of it here to try and replicate it without going crazy with props. You know, I don't want to spend an hour building one fountain, so I think this sort of does the trick. The Embarcadero Plaza isn't to scale either. It's sort of just squeezed in here. It's definitely influenced by the real life version, but mine's more or less just squeezed in here to fit into my city. So now I can look to finish off the rest of the city, and I'm going to put a few courts in here, like basketball and tennis courts, because there's a few in real life. So they'll also have some fences and stuff around them like that, and various trees, and the rest of the area is just bush and some retaining walls here and there. And I also make one more green space across the road from the CoosBar Park as well. The last thing I do before I finish the episode is use the intersection marking tool to put these big islands in, and I try and get the colour right here as well. I don't know if it's perfect. We put a few trees out on the island as well, and this is sort of the last piece of the puzzle. I can also use the traffic management mod and make sure all of the lanes go in the appropriate places. Then we can zoom out and have a look at what we've built. I was actually hoping to get a lot more of the waterfront done, but looking back at this now, I'm happy that we've only done this much because it meant that I could do it properly and not rush. I love the fact that we've finally got a part of the coast done, and it's the part right next to downtown, so it's looking really good here, and this is the most officially complete part of the city as it stands. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you've been following the series, an extra thank you to you, and if you don't subscribe, I would love it if you considered subscribing to me, and I hope to see all of you guys on the next episode. So take it easy, and I'll see you later.